Christian Western Europe and learned magic have always had a kind of paradoxical relationship. With the advent of Christianity, magic has faced a basically uncompromising and stern ban, often employing the threat and the reality of capital punishment in order to ensure its suppression. Yet, the evidence is clear that learned magic not only survived, but thrived in the Christian context. Indeed, its theorizers, its manuscript copiers, its promulgators and practitioners could all be found within the ranks of the Church itself, what is now called the clerical necromantic underground. This complicated relationship, or a simultaneous ban upon and yet an engagement with learned magic, is a curious fault line in the history of religion, philosophy, science, and magic. What do learned medieval attitudes about magic reveal? Just how total was this ban? How did they think magic worked, and exactly what did magic mean to them? Indeed, were all forms of magic banned? Could some forms of magic leave the door open for others? In this episode of Esoterica, we're going to survey some of the major and some of the more interesting minor figures in the history of scholastic attitudes toward medieval magic. What we'll discover is a range of attitudes which all seem to at first foreclose upon the possibility of any magic whatsoever. But, as we read between the lines, we'll see that learned magic not only survived, but thrived in the Middle Ages. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. Magic was ubiquitous in the late classical world. Roger Bacon comments that Christianity only had two major competitors early in its history, magic and philosophy. Perhaps none would be so acquainted with both as St. Augustine. As you probably know, Augustine spent most of his life vacillating between being a late classical rake, a philosopher, a Manichaean, before being an ardent convert to Catholicism in late August of 386. He would go on to become the chief architect of Christian theology in the Latin West, and to my mind has the single best prayer ever uttered by a human being: Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. Augustine's treatment of magic is quite severe, but it's not unlike other apostolic fathers. Unlike many pagan thinkers, such as Porphyry or Iamblichus, for whom there was a moral and theological distinction to be made between Goetia and Theurgia, Goetia of course being negative, harmful magic, and Theurgia being divine magic, this basically being the classical distinction between good and evil magic. Augustine, however, argues that they differ in name only, that there is no fundamental distinction between Goetia and Theurgia. Rather, both are, quote, entangled in the rites of demons who masquerade as good angels. For Augustine, the entire project of magic is a vast snare for humans set by demons. In his thinking, demons have actually revealed their various symbolic attractors to humans long ago, which include a vast range of things such as plants, animals, incantations, and ceremonial rites, which only serve to welcome the demons into relationships with human beings, thus springing the spiritual trap. Augustine also believes that lesser demons can be harangued by the magician by threatening them the force of more powerful demons, an idea that will also appear later in Solomonic magic. Further, he even claims that the marvels accomplished by magicians in his day outmatch those accomplished by Christians through prayer, although Augustine does believe that in time, Christianity will ultimately triumph over the power of magic. So how exactly does Augustine take magic to work? For him, magic is actually effectuated by the power of demons, rather than the words, symbols, or the power of the magician themselves. Demons are able to accomplish these apparent marvels because of their great longevity and their physical nature. Because demons have lived for vast ages and because their senses are so keen, they have an exact understanding of the mechanisms of nature, thus giving them the apparent ability to predict the future or to produce vast marvels. Further, demons are also composed of a very fine kind of ethereal matter, according to Augustine. This gives them the ability to travel at incredible speeds, thereby accomplishing distant tasks and what appears to be simultaneity for human beings. Also, given their very fine nature, they're also able to penetrate into the bodies of human beings, thus affecting their mental and emotional states. All of this combined, at least according to Augustine, proves why demons can do apparently marvelous things, such as predicting the future, finding lost treasure, causing love or madness, or the experience of vast illusions. Of course, the demons lead the magician to believe that they are causing these marvels, but the entire business is only meant to delude and eventually damn the sorcerer. For Augustine, magic is simply a trap whereby demons eventually destroy human beings. The next major source for magic in the Latin West will probably be someone like Isidor of Seville. His text, the Etymologies, becomes basically the encyclopedia for almost all knowledge in the early Middle Ages and beyond. As Isidor tells it, magic was invented by the Persian prophet Zoroaster and greatly expanded by the Greek philosopher Democritus, and finally promulgated to the rest of the world by, quote, evil angels. He divides magic into several different subspecies, including auguries, divinations, oracles, and necromancy. He also mentions Maleficus, which will later be translated as witchcraft, although it literally just means evil doing, as those who agitate the elements, disturb the minds of people, and slay without using poisons, using the power of spells alone. These are further grouped together with various forms of divination, such as those who use the four elements to foretell the future, the use of astrology, and the casting of lots. It's also worth noting that Isidor separates between superstitious astrology and non-superstitious astrology, although he doesn't exactly tell us what the difference is. It's possible he has in mind the use of casting nativities. What's important about this lack of clarity between superstitious and non-superstitious astrology in the future is going to be that astrologers can always claim they're doing the non-superstitious version because Isidor is never clear about exactly what the superstitious version is. As for me, I'm always on team vagueness when it comes to pronouncements from religious authorities. And finally, toward the end, Isidor also mentions those who create illusions, but this might mean sleight of hand or the kind of work that medieval jugglers did. Isidor's list and its description is culled from a variety of sources, and one notices a kind of vacillation in his thinking. While Isidor does follow Augustine by claiming that magic is accomplished by a, quote, pestilential alliance between humans and evil angels, his analysis basically provides the landscape and tenor for the vast majority of magical practices through the later Middle Ages, and would basically be copied by many of the early scholastics, such as Abelard, St. Hugh of Victor, and beyond. Though it is in John of Salisbury that we have the first greatly expanded, though somewhat rambling, account of magic following Isidor. It is in John's work that we have some of the earliest mentions that demons can affect dreams. In fact, he seems to believe that most dreams are the work of demons. He is especially concerned with the dreams held by some women that they travel through the night to engage in some kind of unholy convocation. This is very likely a reference to the canon Episcopi, which, to my knowledge, is the earliest mention of night travels to the witches' Sabbath, where women are said to ride upon certain beasts with Diana and meet with other innumerable women. What they do there is less than clear. What's important, however, is that both the canon and John of Salisbury take that these dreams are just that, dreams. They do not represent actual night journeys to the witches' Sabbath. And it's exactly that point, whether women actually travel in the night to meet with other women at the Sabbath, that will become a serious point of contention in the later witch trials. It's also worth noting that John's Latin teacher as a child was probably also himself a necromancer. John recounts a fascinating story where both he and an older student were both goaded into scrying, that is to say the art of gazing into a polished surface to see supernatural entities, by their Latin teacher. He tells how the teacher did some kind of incantation in a language he didn't understand, and then applied some kind of magical ointment to their fingernails. John himself says he saw nothing during the scrying session, although apparently the older student saw, quote, certain misty figures. Such practices are well attested in later medieval magical manuscripts. And it's interesting that John notes this practice was widespread, although he does say that those who practiced it earlier in their life were afflicted with blindness later in their life. So not only in John of Salisbury do we have an expanded understanding of what magic was during this time, but also eyewitness testimony that necromantic magic was being practiced by none other than priests during this period, and was apparently widespread. The great public intellectual and translator Michael Scott argues for a very distinct separation between magic and astrology in his famous Introduction. Arguing that the stars only indicate good and evil in the world rather than cause it, Scott begins to introduce a very subtle distinction between the practice of magic and the practice of astrology. For him, astrology is the domain of a kind of science or natural philosophy, whereas magic remains the realm of demonic deception. Though, despite this very strong separation, at least in words at the very beginning of Scott's introduction, something interesting begins to happen as you read the text. As one reads on, the difference between science and magic begins to blur, and Scott introduces all kinds of interesting lore and stories from apparent necromantic sources. Specifically under the aegis of scientific astrology, Scott begins to tell the reader about the nature of all kinds of demons who live in the astral world, how these demons can be summoned using certain kinds of images, and even the location of demons, for instance, evil demons living in the winds, or even some demons living in the moon. And he even goes on to suggest how these demons might be summoned, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, though, necromancy is forbidden, right? You can't really do it, but here's how, kinda. Maybe. Michael Scott, in his introduction to astrology, seems to be inaugurating a kind of practice that we'll see play out over and over again during the Scholastic period. At the beginning of his text, and out one side of his mouth, he says, of course, necromancy is forbidden and you can't summon demons to do your bidding. But then, further into the text, and out of the other side of his mouth, he says, well, if one were to summon demons, here are all the names of the demons, and here's where they all live, and here are the images by which one can summon them, and if you really wanted to summon them, here's how one might do that. It's clear that Scott has access to necromantic wisdom and is sort of leaking that wisdom out under the aegis of calling it something like science or astrology. Of course, Scott wasn't exactly subtle about all this, and it didn't go unnoticed. In the centuries that followed Michael Scott's death, increasingly he became thought of as himself a necromancer, with even Dante placing Scott in the 8th circle of hell, with his head turned around backwards like all diviners, the ironic punishment for someone who spent their life looking to foretell the future. By the beginning of the 13th century, the great translation projects of the century prior were complete. Alchemy, astrology, and other hermetic sciences had settled into Western Europe, and already we see the appearance of the Ars Notoria, a text by which one can gain rapid knowledge of the liberal arts through the use of incantations and angels. And perhaps more importantly, we see the importation of the Picatrix, the famed text of astral magic, from Islamic lands. By the mid-13th century, the University of Paris had emerged as the central school for theological learning in Europe, and we also have the appearance of the infamous Goliard poets. Of course, the bawdy poetry of the Goliard poets tell us that the students at Paris were just as interested in gambling and lovemaking as they were in theology. William, or Guillaume of Auvergne, Bishop of Paris from 1228 to his death in 1249, betrays the most encyclopedic knowledge of magic for his time, and also very likely had access to necromantic texts. What's also crucially important about William is that he embraces the natural philosophy, what we would now call science, that was beginning to flourish during his lifetime. For William, magic is the art of producing marvels, and can be accomplished through a variety of means, including straightforward trickery, through demons, or through the use and manipulation of occult forces which are to be found in nature. The manipulation of these occult forces in nature he simply terms natural magic. Indeed, even the demons can only accomplish their marvels, according to William, by the manipulation of these exact occult forces. Here we have a rather incredible piece of advice. In order to produce these marvels, it seems like human beings should simply cut out the middleman, or middle demon, and produce those marvels themselves. For William, there's no strict theological problem in the production of marvels. The problem is that necromancy involves oblations to demonic forces which are themselves inherently idolatrous. So one is allowed to produce marvels, one just can't go about it by the use of necromancy. Because demons have to use the exact same occult forces found in nature to accomplish their work, he rejects the viability of various forms of magic. For instance, the idea that waxen images can cause harm, or that statues can be made to talk as if they were gods. He's leaning here on the Latin Aesculapius text found in the Corpus Hermeticum. He also rejects the inherent power of magical symbols and images, and concludes that there is no magic in the, quote, angles of Solomon's pentagon, a clear reference to the use of Solomonic magic, which is apparently already thriving in Paris during his lifetime. Though, importantly, it is in William's text that we see the research agenda set up for a kind of natural magic. and he urges on research into the occult properties of animals, plants, and gems, etc. Of course, we should recall that Hildegard of Bingen had already made this point about the occult properties of gems, stones, and animals a century prior. So William may be a little late to the game. Score 1 for Hildegard. And what is interesting is that William is willing to quote from a wide variety of texts in order to discover the truth about magic. Everything from Plato to Aristotle to the text of Hermes Trismegistus to even, as we've seen, straightforwardly necromantic tomes. While William does seem to accept the possibility of divination, he argues that it is very likely inherently demonic. Weirdly enough, he notes that only 1 in 7 young boys have the ability to engage in this kind of necromantic scrying. Of course, we've already seen the prevalence of this practice back in John of Salisbury. Though how he comes to a 14% success rate in using young boys to peer into the future is a bit weird. It's real weird. Of course, what's also important here about William is his social position. He's the Archbishop of Paris. And at this crucial period, where philosophy, natural philosophy, magic, and necromancy are all sort of muddled together, the fact that he opens the door to the possibility of some of these practices is going to have crucial ramifications for the future of magical practice in Europe. Of course, straightforward necromantic practices are going to remain forbidden. But attempting to produce marvels, which are indistinguishable from magic via other occult means, seem to be somewhat acceptable. And further, because William is consulting necromantic manuals, it may be at least justifiable for someone else to consult them, even if they don't, strictly speaking, practice them. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Indeed, through the later Middle Ages, we'll constantly see people reference these various necromantic manuals that they've either seen or have access to. And they almost always say the same thing, that they're consulting these manuals for quote-unquote research rather than actually learning to practice them. But of course we know there was significant necromantic practice throughout the Middle Ages, so they were doing a lot more than just research. If William can be said to have instituted the research program around natural magic, then certainly Albertus Magnus can be said to be its first great student. Of course, Albert rehearses the condemnation of necromancy, but his research probes into both the exoteric and esoteric dimensions of nature and the cosmos itself. Here, Albert's working like a kind of scientist of necromancy. Here, he researches past and present necromancers to see how they produce the marvels that he admits do exist. In fact, it is in Albert that for the first time we see phrases like good magic used in a Christian context. And he specifically uses the example of the Magi that attended to the baby Jesus as an example of said good magic. Despite condemning the practice in many of his theological texts, we see him extending the definition of quote good magic into the capturing of astral forces into various gems, especially those gems that are engraved with various kinds of symbology. These engraved gems have what we would now consider a wide range of magical powers. He even urges his readers to study necromancy in order that they may fully understand it. For Albert, the necromancers don't really understand the mechanisms that are causing the marvels that they can produce, and it will be through a research agenda like his that will ultimately unveil the secrets of nature and the power of natural magic. So again, we have here the idea that necromancy is of course forbidden, but the admonition that we should further research it in order to unlock its secrets. Of course, no discussion of this period would be complete without a mention of Thomas Aquinas. Though I have to admit, Thomas's discussion of magic doesn't add a great deal to the conversation here. What is perhaps most interesting in Thomas's discussion is his logical deductions that demons and demons alone can be responsible for necromantic power. For Thomas, speech and symbols only work from one intelligence to another. For instance, when I generate words from my intelligence and speak them, and you hear them through this YouTube episode, it's only because of your receptive intelligence that those words can enter through your senses and make an impression upon your intelligence. Words and symbols are only a medium through which intelligences can communicate. So there's a basic problem here for Thomas. The sublunar world is basically unintelligent aside from human beings. So if magical words such as incantations and magical symbols accomplish their task only from intelligence to intelligence, how is it that intelligence stemming from the necromancer can affect unintelligent matter such as nature? Well, of course, from logical deduction, the answer must be demons, because medieval logical deduction. To use the language of medieval scholastic philosophy, demons are the efficient cause of necromancy. What we effectively have here is a deduction using Aristotelian logic and metaphysics about how demonic magic works, which is kind of metal. Thomas will go on to extend this logic to things like medical amulets as well. Though he agrees with Maimonides, interestingly enough, that if divine names or scripture are placed on these amulets, they're not inherently bad, although he does discourage it. What seems to be at work in both the thinking of Maimonides and Thomas is something like the placebo effect. That while the amulets themselves won't necessarily work, because they're not inherently idolatrous, they'll perhaps make the patient feel better. And therefore he doesn't actively ban them, which is an interesting insight into the early psychology of medicine. Of course, Thomas also admits that there are a wide variety of occult forces in nature, which can be manipulated for the interests of human beings. He also seems to accept the power of astral rays upon various physical bodies, especially gems, and of course, he mentions magnets. Oh yeah, did I mention that everybody mentions magnets? They love magnets in the Middle Ages. Of course, Roger Bacon was among the greatest of the natural philosophers or scientists of the Middle Ages, and it seems that magic interested him greatly. He clearly had access to a wide range of magical and necromantic texts. And given his wide-ranging knowledge, it's conspicuous that he dismisses magic, especially necromantic magic, as primarily delusional. Indeed, Bacon's attitude toward magic is perhaps the most skeptical of this period, and he reads much more like someone from the 18th century than someone from the 13th century. But of course, Bacon is a man of his time, and his world abounds in astral rays and occult forces, which are not reducible to the basic structure of a substance. For Bacon, generation and corruption can be attributed to astral forces. And these astral forces can even be used to explain the temperaments of human beings, including widespread outbreaks of violence and war. While Bacon represents a more skeptical attitude toward magic than his contemporaries, it's important to note that he sees the natural sciences as primarily speculative. For him, it is the experimental sciences, which are primarily the domain of occult studies, which need to be imported into the study of natural philosophy. We shouldn't forget that in the Middle Ages, the typical term for a magical spell and learn magic was a, quote, experimentum. Here, it seems at least, Bacon is interested in importing the experimental method of magic in order to support natural philosophy. But of course he wants to do this in order to eradicate what he takes to be nonsense delusional magic. Although we should be careful here, just what Bacon means by an experiment is never really spelled out by him, and we shouldn't simply rush to conclude that he was a kind of radical British empiricist a la the 18th century. But to his credit, Bacon has one of the most open minds of anyone in this period. Insofar as magic, necromantic or otherwise, has any viability at all, he was certainly interested in researching it. Through the 13th century, the astrological sciences themselves would be greatly improved by people like Guido Bonatti, though he would also end up in Dante's hell. I'm probably going to end up in Dante's hell. Seems like neat people. Astrological medicine would also be greatly improved upon by people like Arnold of Villanova. And despite his mostly apocryphal reputation, Raymond of Lull wrote very little about magic, in fact, though he did develop a very interesting computational mechanism for the development of education. This would allegedly increase learning speed and greatly help with the art of memory, which itself had necromantic undertones, despite the fact that Lull himself seemed to have had very little interest in the topic of magic. Even his reputation as an alchemist is worthy of doubt, despite the fact that it's clear that his disciples were very interested in that topic. The same can be said of Peter of Abano, who wrote very little on magic, though by the mid-15th century was heavily associated with it. The Solomonic magical text, the Heptameron, is associated with him, although there's very little reason to believe that he actually wrote it. This reputation of Peter as a magician may have something to do with the combination of his writings on poisons and also his sort of aberrant theological beliefs. Though, to be sure, Peter of Abano is now forever linked, like Michael Scott, with necromancy. Finally, we come to the curious figure of Checo da Scoli. For our purposes, we're going to turn to look at his commentary on the Sphere of Sacrobosco, perhaps the most common textbook on astrology in the Middle Ages. What makes Checo's commentary on the Sphere so interesting is that he seems that he can't help himself but to constantly detour into a commentary on astral necromancy. At the beginning of his commentary, like everyone else, he rehearses the classic condemnation of necromancy. And then he quickly goes on to give detailed exposition and even blatant introductions into necromantic texts, including various rites and magical procedures, the names of demons, and even their exact location in the cosmos. And again, this is always framed as how one might summon one of these demons. A couple of the demons that he mentions are worth repeating here. One is a certain Floron with a magic mirror. We see that exact same demon and the magic mirror mentioned in the famed Munich Necromancer's Manual, which I've done another episode about. You can click the card above to learn more about that magical manuscript. And another demon, one of the demons of the cardinal directions, is Paimon, a demon that will appear in several other necromantic texts, most famously the Lesser Key of Solomon, and more recently in the film Hereditary. Checo's commentary is basically a thinly veiled necromantic manual. We are unsurprised to learn that he was arrested by the Inquisition and burned at the stake on September 26, 1327, as a relapsed heretic. Indeed, he seems to be one of the earliest learned people to be executed for such a crime. His execution, along with that of Dame Alice Kittler in Ireland only a few years later in 1324, perhaps signal a reaction to the lax days of the 13th century when it comes to matters of magic and necromancy. We can characterize the basic attitude of scholasticism as an inheritance from Augustine, for whom magic was the exclusive domain of demons. Isidor's analysis goes on to tempt us with a far more expansive analysis of these dark arts. But the real shift, as we've seen, begins to occur in the 12th century Renaissance. With the arrival of Aristotle, the importation of alchemy, the improvement of astrology and the other Hermetic sciences, along with the developments found in natural philosophy as imported from the Islamic world, is opened up the possibility of a genuine occult science, or natural magic. And of course, it's at this time that the first genuine necromantic manuals began to appear in Western Europe, along with the rise of the so-called clerical necromantic underground. Of course, natural magic, philosophy, necromancy, and Orthodox religion all remain very strange bedfellows at this time. And unsurprisingly, the powers and temptations promised by necromancy would prove to be too strong. And no doubt there were many scholastics that condemned these dark arts during the day, all the while practicing their experimenta by night. If you're interested in the history of magic, Hermetic philosophy, the occult, Kabbalah, or alchemy, make sure to subscribe. I'd also hope you consider supporting our work here at Esoterica through Patreon or with a one-time donation. We've covered a wide range of authors and texts in this episode, and I've tried to note the title of many of these works as we've gone, although I have to admit many of them are difficult to find and many of them are still in Latin. For a really accessible introduction to medieval magic, I'd highly recommend Richard Kieckhefer's Magic in the Middle Ages. The text is aimed for undergraduates, but I have to say it's still very accessible and of a high degree of scholarship, and certainly among the best starting points for a study in this literature. Of course, the Magic and History series put up by Penn State is an incredible resource, although I have to admit it can be somewhat dense at times. They're excellent resources for very specific studies in the history of magic, well worth checking out, but again, very specific. Of course, the single best resource for all this remains Lynn Thorndike's monumental 8-volume The History of Magic and Experimental Science. These are getting pretty expensive to buy these days, but sometimes you can luck out, like I did, and get one from a library sale. You just have to watch eBay and Abe's List like a hawk. Although I'm not exactly sure of the copyright status of the text, it does appear that all 8 volumes can be found on archive.org. So you can consult them there if you like. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.